And we are streaming live now. I would like to welcome everyone to the European School of Theosophy 2020 with the theme, The Mystery of Consciousness. My name is Erica Georgiadis. I'm part of the team of the school. The European School of Theosophy is a platform, not for profit, focusing on the study of theosophy and esotericism.
What is that, DB? What?
I'm sorry? Okay, I'm going to mute everyone. Just a minute. Okay. The lecture today focuses on the case for idealism, why the evidence points to idealism by Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo's work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy and another PhD in computer engineering. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked for the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, and the Philips Research Laboratories, where the Casimir effect of quantum field theory was discovered. Formulated in detail in many academic papers and books, Bernardo's ideas have been featured on Scientific American and the Institute of Art and Ideas, the blog of the American Philosophical Association, and the Big Think, among others. We also would like to invite you to subscribe to Bernardo's blog to support his work. I want to welcome you all once more. Thank you for being here with us today. The way that the meeting will start is that I will mute your mics, spotlight Bernardo's video. At the end of the lecture, you may ask questions by raising your hand in the chat option. Bernardo, you can share your screen if you wish.
Yes, I will do so.
And then you can start. Welcome, nice seeing you here.
Thanks everybody for being here. Before I even share the slides, just to give context to whoever was not here last week. Last week, the effort was to show that materialism is a malformed metaphysics, so to say. It's based on a few wrong steps of thinking. But of course, that kind of talk is hollow and shallow unless you offer an alternative, unless you show what conclusions are led to if you think correctly about what's going on. So this is what today is all about. So I will share a few slides with you. Hopefully you can all see the slides now. Okay, the title we have already seen, so we can go to the next one. The first question that we should ask ourselves is the question that motivates the materialist metaphysics to begin with. It is a very intuitive and valid question. Why do we think the world is outside consciousness? It is this conclusion that the world is outside consciousness that motivates us to postulate this abstract category of existence that we call matter, and to postulate that it has some kind of standalone reality outside of consciousness itself. So what is it that motivates this conclusion? That's what I want to explore now. There are three main reasons. Number one is that we know that our inner experience correlates with our brain function. And you don't need to be a neuroscientist with a brain scanner to know that if you drink alcohol, which seems to be a material substance in the world out there, and you ingest it, it does something with your brain and it changes your experience. We all know that from first-hand experience. A well-placed punch to your face can do something quite dramatic to your inner experience as well. As somebody who once did karate and jiu-jitsu, I'm very familiar with the alterations of consciousness because of physical trauma. Now, there are other reasons. The second one is we all seem to share the same world. You know, if you were sitting next to me in my study right now, you would describe roughly the same place. Our descriptions would be mutually consistent. You wouldn't describe exactly the same thing because we all have a particular point of view and so on. But our descriptions would be consistent. And indeed, they are. We all think we live on the surface of a planet with trees and buildings and other people and animals and skies and clouds and all that. So we seem to share a world beyond ourselves, which is also part of the motivation to think of the world as material and outside consciousness. And the last one is that, well, although if we are imagining a world, we can change that world by a mere act of imagination, the same doesn't seem to hold for the real world out there. I mean, otherwise it would be very different right now, because I would have wished it to be very different already for a long time. So these are the three reasons that lead materialists to think that the world is outside consciousness. They just make one small but wildly consequential categorical mistake, which is the mistake to say that although there certainly is a world beyond our own individual minds or consciousness, that does not entail or imply that such a world is outside consciousness or mind itself as an ontological category. It's outside my mind, but that doesn't mean that it's outside mind. If you know what I mean. We all know that there are instances of mind beyond ourselves. Other people are minded, animals are minded. We easily believe that in an intuitive manner. But for some reason, we think that the world beyond all living beings, that one cannot be in a mind. That one has to be something fundamentally different from mind itself. That's where it goes wrong. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What we call matter as distinct from mind or consciousness. I use the words mind and consciousness interchangeably, as has been the case in the Western tradition. In the East, they have different words for these two things, but never mind. What we call matter is a theoretical abstraction. It's not something immediately available to our observation, because we are restricted to the things we see, touch, feel, taste, smell, and these are mental. These are experiences. Seeing is an experience. Tasting is an experience. Smelling is an experience. But we say that behind the images that we actually experience, there is something that's not mental. There is something that is not consciousness. And we call it matter. As such, matter is a theoretical inference. It's a theoretical abstraction, and it's meant to explain why we can't change the world by merely wishing it to be different, why we all seem to share the same world, and why inner experience correlates with brain function, those three reasons of the previous slide. It's very important to realize this. It's very important to realize explicitly that matter is not an empirical given. We are forever locked into consciousness, into mind. Matter is a theoretical postulate. It's a theoretical entity, right or wrong. Even if it is right, it is still a theoretical inference. There are many correct theoretical inferences, but for some reason we lost sight of the fact that matter is not available directly to us. It is a theoretical entity. Now, some good physicists are keenly aware of it, and I'm quoting here Andre Linde from Stanford. He's world renowned for his theories of cosmic inflation that have gone a long way in helping us understand the very early stages of the universe's evolution. He admitted that. He basically said, well, what we call matter is something we theoretically infer to help make sense of observations. But at some point we forget that that was a theoretical inference, a theoretical entity. And we take it to be a standalone reality as it is in itself. And that's when things go wrong. Now, if we don't want to make these mistakes, we have to take a number of steps back. We don't want theoretical inferences and postulates here. We want to start from the firm ground of what is given to us by nature, what is given to our observation. So that's where we should start from. we shouldn't start already from a theoretical assumption. That should come later. We should start from the terra firma, the firm ground of the incontrovertible facts of nature. What are these facts? Let's go over them, and then we try to make sense of them with a theoretical model. Since there is experience, there is at least one experiencer, because experience only exists if there is a subject experiencing it. Experience is not a standalone reality. It's something presented to a subject. It's an experience of the subject. So there is an experiencer. We know that because we experience. Now, what that subject is it a living being with bones, muscles, and skin? Is it individual or collective? These are all theoretical points, but it's a given that there is an experiencer because there is experience. Next one. Whatever else it may also be, what we call brain function is an experience too. If nobody had ever experienced brain function through looking through a brain scanner, we wouldn't be talking about it. So neuroscientists experience somebody else's brain function the moment they look at the monitor, the screen of a brain scanner. So whatever else brain function is, we only know it by virtue of the fact that it is experienced too. 3, the brain's made of matter, whatever we call matter. Look, there is this thing we call matter. I'm not denying that. I would be crazy to deny that. What I'm denying and questioning is the conceptual description of what matter is. This is what I deny. But that there is this experience that we colloquially call matter is undeniable. Only the conceptual definition is. The experience itself is undeniable. So there is this thing called matter. And the brain is made of it. There is no denying that. You know, in an anatomy class, one can hold a brain in one's hands and touch it and feel the texture, feel the temperature, feel the shape, look at it and smell it, presumably even lick it. There are people who eat brains. So the brain is made of matter. Whatever matter is, the brain is made of it. That's an undeniable fact of nature. Now, what is the simplest way to make sense of these 3 undeniable givens? What is the simple theoretical move to accommodate this in a way that makes sense to us? I propose the following. The simplest explanation for experience is that it is an excitation of the experiencer. Just like a ripple is an excitation of water. There's nothing to the ripple but water. Just like the dance, the choreography is an excitation of the dancer. There's nothing to the dance but the dancer moving in a certain way. Since we know that there is experience and we know that there is an experiencer, it's simplest to say that the experience and the experiencer are not fundamentally distinct. That the experience is a movement of the experiencer. It is an excitation of the experiencer, a vibration of the experiencer. And this is not only parsimonious, it avoids a whole host of problems. Because if you say experience and experiencer are fundamentally distinct, yeah, then by what means are they coupled? Because the experiencer experiences. So by what means do they exchange information? By what means do they interact? In philosophy, we call this the interaction problem. And it's an unsolvable problem every time people postulate two ontologically distinct entities that are obviously related. The interaction problem is a main argument against dualism, the idea that there is a physical body and there is a fundamentally distinct soul, and the soul and the body interact in some way. Well, if they are fundamentally distinct, how on earth do they interact? You see? So it's simpler to say experience is just a movement, an excitation of the experiencer. Second movement. There are two experiential perspectives. Why is this a parsimonious move? because it allows us to get away with maintaining only the experiencer as primary, nothing else. Because you see, we know that we have inner life, and we know that we have a brain that works. And these two are correlated. So how do I make sense of this without postulating anything more than the experiencer? Well, it's just to look at these two things, the brain and our conscious inner life, as two experiential perspectives, two camera views of the same underlying thing, two viewpoints, two angles of observation, two vantage points towards the same thing. One is the extrinsic. My conscious inner life looks like my brain when it's observed from the outside, from an external perspective. In other words, there is nothing but my conscious inner life. There isn't a brain separate from my conscious inner life. There is only my conscious inner life. But that inner life presents itself to me through a direct perspective, a first person perspective, and it presents itself to another observer through a indirect perspective, an external point of view, through a outside image. There is something my conscious inner life looks like from the perspective of another human being, like a neuroscientist operating a brain scanner. Notice that there aren't two things. There is only my conscious inner life. It's just that that one thing presents itself differently according to the perspective through which it's observed. And of course, both are experiences at the end of the day. The neuroscientist only knows about my conscious inner life if he or she experiences the output of the brain scanner. If nothing's experienced, then we wouldn't be talking about it. Third, I already talked about it. The third interpretational move here that is logical and parsimonious is that what we call brain function is nothing but the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life directly experienced. It's just what it looks like from another perspective. All right. I'm going to argue now. Remember that in the previous slide, we've tried and succeeded in making sense of everything by only postulating one thing going on. It's an experiencer. I will try to convince you now that this experiencer is universal. This is not a proof. Nothing in philosophy is a proof. What I argue is that this is the best explanatory movement we have. Best in terms of being internally consistent, logical, conceptually parsimonious. This is like, with respect to materialism, materialism would be the flying spaghetti monster. We can't disprove it, but we don't need that kind of complication, that kind of conceptual inflation to make sense of things. In the same way, I will argue that the universality of the experiencer is the simplest, most logical, parsimonious explanation. So let's go about arguing that. We've seen before that the brain is made of matter. I'm not conceptually defining what matter is, but there is this thing, this experience we call matter. And whatever it is, the brain is constituted of it. There is no question there. We also know that what we call, it's not that we also know, but we know that at least in our case, the matter constituting our body, our brain, is the extrinsic appearance of our conscious inner life. That's an easy way to make sense of why brain activity correlates with inner experience. It's an image of inner experience. So of course it correlates with it. It's the way it presents itself to observation from an external perspective. Obviously it correlates. And that extrinsic appearance is made of this thing we call matter. There is no denying that. So at least in our case, it would seem that the matter in our body is the extrinsic appearance of our conscious inner life. When we are no longer conscious, when we are dead, that matter seems to very quickly lose its coherence. It sort of dissolves into an entropic soup. We call it decomposition. Somehow, when it's not accompanied by conscious inner life, it loses its structural integrity. Now, next point. if we know that our brain is made of matter, and that our brain and our body are the extrinsic appearance of our conscious inner life, and we know that the rest of the universe is also made of the same atoms and force fields that our brain is made of, then I submit to you that the most plausible, parsimonious, and logical explanation is to say that the entire material universe, because it's also made of matter, just like our body, is the extrinsic appearance of universal conscious inner life as well, of the ultimate subject of experience, the ultimate experiencer. And the point here is, look, what I'm saying is that what matter is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. There is nothing more to it. That thing we experience and we call matter, it is what conscious inner life looks like from our perspective. This is what matter is, and there is nothing more to matter than that. It does not have standalone existence. It is, in our case, what our conscious inner life looks like, and it is the same for the rest of the material universe as well. Therefore, there has to be an experiencer behind that, a universal experiencer. And then you may say, well, you're solving one problem, but you're creating 10 others, because now how do I explain my individual conscious inner life if there is only one experiencer? How come I can't read your thoughts, Bernardo? How come I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda right now, if all of that is the extrinsic appearance of one mind, one consciousness? We are going to get to that. As a matter of fact, there are strong, not only anecdotal, but strong theoretical reasons to come to this conclusion, because since we've become able with the modern computer technology in the 21st century to model the shape, the appearance of the universe at its largest scales, we need computers to do that, because we cannot stand outside the universe in order to look at it with a telescope. But with computers, we can apply our cosmological models and figure out what the universe looks like at its largest scales, if we could see it. And what it looks like is surprisingly similar to a nervous system. And okay, I'm showing you two images that made headlines in 2006, but let me acknowledge immediately to you that we can make two images look alike, any two images look alike, if we crop them in just the right way, apply the right color filters, and yes, but that's not the point. The point is that this similarity in structure, in network structure, between the universe at its largest scales and biological nervous systems can be shown to be the case even with the modern arsenal of information theory. We can study the network topology of these two entities and run objective mathematical tests to see how similar they are. And they are uncomfortably similar. They are so similar, it's impossible to think the similarities by chance. And yet we do not have any theoretical explanation for why they should be similar. Why does the network of galaxies, of superclusters, look more like a network of neurons than it looks like a galaxy, an individual galaxy? I mean, this, why? This clamors for an explanation. And I submit to you that it's because all matter is the extrinsic appearance of inner experience, and the same holds for the superclusters of galaxies in the universe at its largest scales. I alluded to this already, but as I mentioned to you, this is not just a matter of two pretty images looking alike to observation. There are information theoretical models that show that this is the case, including a very recent one by Franco Vatta and Alberto Faletti. One is a neuroscientist, the other one is a cosmologist, a physicist. All right. Now, we've said there are two perspectives to experience. One is a direct first-person experience, and the other one is an extrinsic appearance, the way inner experience looks like from outside observation. So it immediately raises the question, why do we have this partition? Why are there two perspectives? If the universe is one big universal mind, why aren't there then just universal thoughts? Why are there appearances, outside appearances? How does the outside come about to begin with? Where does it arise from? If everything is in one mind, what does it mean to talk about there being an outside appearance? Outside to what? So this is what we need to tackle now. I submit to you, I'll talk in temporal terms because it's easier to explain it as a story in time, but I don't mean it literally that way. No. Imagine that in the beginning, once upon a time, there was only this one universal mind, one universal consciousness, and it had thoughts and ideas, emotions. I'm talking about ideas and thoughts. And that's all there was to it. So there would be no extrinsic appearance. There would be only an intrinsic perspective, a direct first-person perspective to experience. The experienced ideas and emotions and thoughts and whatnot. These would be endogenous experiences. They would not have a perceptual character. There would be no seeing, no smelling, no touching. There would only be inner-generated experiences like ideas and emotions. And then something else happened at some point. There was dissociation. This is something well known in psychiatry. Dissociation is when a subset of the content of mind split off from the rest, and you are no longer able to bridge these two sets through inference. In other words, you are unable to think your way into a dissociated part of your own mind, into a dissociated memory. You become separate from it. People undergo dissociation all the time. It's a normal, even healthy part of being human, our capability to dissociate from things that we don't want to deal with, memories we don't want to deal with, feelings we don't want to deal with, or we can't. If it's not extreme, if it doesn't become pathological, this is a functional self-protection mechanism. It contributes to our ability to perform, to survive. So there is nothing spectacular about dissociation. We all experience it. It's well known in the annals of psychiatry. Now, what I submit to you is that although we only know dissociation within a human being, I submit to you that something analogous to dissociation exists in nature at a universal level. And at some point, some of those ideas and emotions of this universal mind have become dissociated. They have split off. And there was no inferential bridge between these two subdomains. A dissociative boundary was created. And now you have an inside and an outside, because now you have a boundary, a dissociative boundary. This dissociated cluster of ideas and emotions in psychiatry, it's called an alter. So I'll be using that word now, alters. It comes from alternative personality or something like this. Now, this dissociative boundary that delineates and circumscribes an alter with its own dissociated mental contents is a kind of screen. It's a boundary. And I submit to you that the ideas and emotions outside, let me see if I can turn on my laser pointer. These ideas and emotions outside the alter, although they are dissociated from the alter, they still impinge on this dissociative boundary. Let me try to give examples that you can directly relate to. Suppose you're having relationship problems at work. You had a fight with your wife, your husband, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, and then you need to go to work. And to perform at work, you cannot have all those emotions related to the fight in your mind all day, otherwise you will do nothing. So you compartmentalize it. You sort of put them in a drawer, and you deliberately dissociate from those emotions. And some people are very effective at it. I'm ashamed to say I'm very effective at it. In my case, it goes beyond what would be healthy, I think. So during your workday, you're completely dissociated from those emotions, but they still impinge on you. They, in a very subtle way, they will color your thinking. They will color what you conclude from things. You may become more pessimistic. You may make more sanguine and negative assessments of things. It may color what you write on a report at work. It may color how you react to people. People may push a button, and normally you wouldn't mind, but because of those dissociated emotions you're carrying, that thing that pushes a little button in you can escalate a lot more. So even though those emotions remain dissociated in the sense that you're not experiencing the emotions themselves, they are compartmentalized in a little drawer, you're not experiencing them, but they will color and modulate what you do experience. And I will call that an impingement on your dissociative boundary. I mean, there is a lot more objective theoretical underpinning for what I'm saying, but I'm trying to appeal to your direct intuitions in this presentation. So there is an impingement of the outside onto the boundary of the dissociated boundary. And I submit to you, no, Floki, my cat is demanding my attention right now. I submit to you that this impingement is experienced, and we have a name for it. We call it perception. That's what we call it. We call this impingement the contents of perception. That's what the impingement feels like. That's what it looks like. No, buddy. No. I don't know whether you can see my cat, but not now. And so the colors you see around you, the smells you feel, the textures you can touch, the flavors you feel, this is the mental activity that constitutes the world around you impinging on your dissociative boundary. And what does that dissociative boundary looks like? Well, it looks like your skin, your retinas, your eardrums, the inner lining of your nose, your tongue, your sense organs, which surround your body. Certainly your skin does. And so that impingement is registered by us as perception, because there has been an evolutionary advantage for us to register the impingement. It gives us information about the outside world, about what's going on around us, and it helps us survive because we need that information about the outside world in order to navigate it effectively. So our body has developed these sense organs to maximize that impingement, to give us as much information as possible at a glance, in a sort of a dashboard of dials. And we call that perception. And it's much more effective if we were experiencing these dissociated thoughts directly. We would feel as disorientated as a telepath in the middle of an agitated crowd. How could we navigate the world like that? No, we can't. It's better to encode all that in a little dashboard, like an airplane pilot flying by instrument with a storm outside. It's better that instrument panel than to be outside in this storm, right? It's much more conducive to survival. So that's why our sense organs have evolved to give us information about the world outside, not in a direct form, in the form of the thoughts and the emotions and ideas out there, but in an indirect encoded form that captures the information through this impingement on our dissociative boundary. So let me try to illustrate that now. What we see out there is the extrinsic appearance, as captured through our sense organs, of transpersonal ideas, emotions, and thoughts out there. Transpersonal, not the thoughts of another person, not the thoughts of my cat, not the thoughts of an amoeba swimming in your toilet, but thoughts that are not encompassed by any living being, but which constitute the matrix out of which every living being arises through dissociation. Life is the image of dissociation in universal consciousness. And that's why I can't read your thoughts. That's why I don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda, because I'm dissociated from those thoughts, from those happenings in the galaxy of Andromeda. Now, I submit to you that the physical body is what a dissociative alter looks like from an outside perspective. Universal consciousness undergoes something akin, something analogous to dissociative identity disorder in people. And we don't need a brain scanner to diagnose that dissociative identity disorder, because our sense organs are the scanner. They have evolved to pick out information about other dissociative processes, and those are other living bodies. Life itself, metabolism, is the extrinsic appearance of this dissociative process in universal consciousness. We are dissociated outers of universal consciousness. So suppose there is a second outer one, and you are an outer two, and you are outer one. Now, this outer two, the dissociated inner activity of outer two, also impinges onto the universe at large, because the impingement works both ways. We leave a footprint on the world just by being in it. The volume of our body dislocates air. We leave literal footprints on the ground. We use our hands and legs to manipulate the world. We produce sounds. We reflect photons. That's why we are visible. We reflect photons from light sources that bounce off us. We even emit some photons, some animals at least. So we leave a footprint. That footprint is the impingement of our conscious inner life onto our environment, an environment made of transpersonal thoughts and ideas. And then that environment, in turn, impinges on the dissociative boundary of another person. And that's why you see the first person. The body of the first person is the appearance of that chain of impingements across dissociative boundaries. In a nutshell, in one statement, your body is what your dissociated conscious inner life looks like from my perspective. That's what a body is. It's the extrinsic appearance of dissociated inner life as observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. So when a person has DID, let me wet my mouth. When a person has dissociative identity disorder, we can put this person in a brain scanner, as was done in 2014 here in the Netherlands. I'm giving you the reference here. The dissociative processes have a certain appearance. They look like something. They are distinct enough that we can make a diagnosis of DID based on what those dissociative processes look like. They are distinctive from normal mental processes under a brain scanner. We know that because Yolanda Schlumpf and others, they used actors using an acting technique. I don't know what the name is, but it's when an actor internalizes the inner life of the character the actor is playing. In other words, the actor not only acts outwardly, but he or she acts inwardly as well. He tries to be that character. He tries to feel what the character feels. So they got a bunch of actors to apply this technique and pretend to themselves that they had dissociative identity disorder. They tried to feel like that because that's the closest thing we can get to pretending to have the disorder. A lot of people over the last century have questioned whether DID was authentic at all. Some cynical psychiatrists thought people were faking it, even though their lives were destroyed by it. They still thought these people were attention seekers and they were faking it. So Yolanda Schlumpf tried to use that as a control group. Let's see whether we can differentiate the brain activity of actors pretending to have dissociation from people who are actually diagnosed with dissociation. And lo and behold, they could make that distinction fairly directly, because these things have a unique appearance under a brain scanner. So if something like dissociation is happening at a universal level, because the universe as a whole looks like a nervous system, looks like a brain, if you will, I'm saying this metaphorically, then there should be something dissociation looks like in this universal brain. And guess what? I submit to you that there is, and we call it life. We call it biology. There's a direct correspondence between the little mental processes Yolanda Schlumpf has detected. It's just that in this case, we are inside that nervous system. We are not separated from it by a skull. We are inside the universe. So we don't need a brain scanner. We just look around and there you are. There you go. You see those other dissociative processes out there. So I'll try to summarize all of this now. What we call the empirical reality the physical world we can observe when we look around, the stars in the night sky. I would submit to you that that's our outer's view, our outer's perspective of mental processes going on beyond the boundaries of our outer, outside our outer. Those transpersonal mental processes impinge on the boundaries of our outer, which look like skin, eyes, ears, nose, and then the resulting image is what we call the empirical universe, the empirical world. That's what it is. Notice that science doesn't study what things are. Science studies how things behave. So I'm offering you not a scientific perspective, but a philosophical perspective here. That's what the empirical universe is, regardless of how it behaves. Living creatures are an outer's view of other dissociative processes, as observed from across at least one dissociative boundary, sometimes two, yours and mine. So all processes going on in universal consciousness are experiential in nature. And we only have these two perspectives, the extrinsic appearance and the intrinsic view, because of dissociation. It's dissociation that creates this boundary in terms of which we can talk about extrinsic appearances and intrinsic views. But ultimately, everything is experiential. We do not need matter in the sense we define matter conceptually under materialism as something that has a standalone reality outside and independent of mentation. No, matter is just the appearance, the image of mental processes, what those mental processes look like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. That's what matter is. And ultimately, everything is then experiential. There is no standalone matter because matter is just an appearance of something else, the way something else looks like. All outer views are also experiential. So again, there is nothing but experience. So experience alone is sufficient to account for all known reality. And then we no longer have the so-called hard problem of consciousness in which we try to explain matter, or sorry, in which we try to explain consciousness in terms of something else, because there isn't this something else. So all you have to do is we have to explain everything in terms of consciousness. But consciousness itself does not have an explanation because it's nature's sole given. It's what there is. You can't reduce it to something else because there is nothing else. It's what's going on. What you can do now is explain everything else in terms of it by modeling everything else as patterns of excitation of consciousness. Just as there can be many types of ripples, there can be many types of experiences, but all experiences are patterns of excitation of the universal experiencer, in the same way that all ripples, different as they may be, are patterns of excitation of the water, of the lake, whatever you're looking at. There is nothing to the ripples but the lake in movement. In the same way, there is nothing to the universe but the ultimate experiencer in movement, being excited, like the water is excited to form ripples and whirlpools and all that. Okay, so we started with three undeniable observations about reality. I hope you remember them all. You know, inner experience correlates with brain function. There is definitely a world out there that we all inhabit, and we can't change that external world by a mere act of volition. So how do we explain all that in terms of the more parsimonious, internally consistent metaphysical idea I just shared with you? Let's go one by one. Brain function correlates with inner experience. Of course it does, because brain function is the extrinsic appearance of the inner experience, as observed from across the dissociative boundary. The image of the process correlates with the process because it's what the process looks like. Of course, it correlates with it. It's what the thing looks like. Second point, we all seem to share the same world. Of course we do. We are all dissociated alters immersed in the same field of transpersonal thoughts, emotions, ideas. So yes, we share that world. We share a transpersonal world of experience. It's just that that world isn't material in a standalone sense, Matter is just what that world looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. So we don't share a material world, but we do share a world. We do share a mental world in which we are all immersed. And the material world is not shared. My material world is not shared with yours because, my perspective of observation in the universe is different from yours. You're not occupying the same volume of space I am. And actually, this solves a very serious problem in physics, what I just told you. I'll get to it soon. And the laws of nature are independent of our desires. Of course they are. We are dissociated from the rest of the world. So we can't change it by a mere act of volition because we are dissociated from it. Now, is this scientifically substantiated, what I'm telling you? There was an essay published on Nature, the world's most preeminent scientific publication, back in 2005 already. And in it, a very well-renowned physicist, Richard Cohn Henry, he ran out of patience and he said, guys, come on, let's just bite the bullet because that's what every single line of reasoning and experimentation is telling us. There is no physical universe out there. The universe is mental, and physicality is how the mental universe presents itself to us. That was his point. And he got away with publishing an essay in Nature in which he went farther than I would go. He says the universe is entirely mental. Well, I agree with that, but then he says the universe is immaterial and it's spiritual. Well, I don't know what one means by spiritual. I think every person has a different definition, so I wouldn't use that word myself. According to my definition of spiritual, it would be, but I don't know whether you share my definition. But he got away with saying that in Nature. And then, so you see, there was a whole host. I'm mentioning only 5 papers, but the latest count, we're getting rather closer to 50 than 5. A whole host of experiments in quantum mechanics, experiments related to quantum entanglement, which show us that there is no standalone physical world. It's just not there. Physicality only comes into being when we measure the world. In other words, when we observe it. Before that, we can't speak of a physical world with defined properties. Every experiment that we are done now, we have the technology to do these experiments now, contradict this idea, an idea technically called physical realism or non-contextuality in physics, which is this idea that physical things exist, have a standalone existence out there, whether we are looking at them or not. No. Well, guess what? They don't, because physicality is the image of a mental world. What has standalone existence are those transpersonal thoughts and emotions out there. Those have, but physicality only arises when our dissociated mentation interacts with that transpersonal mental substrate in which we are immersed. It's that interaction, that interference pattern, that observation, that measurement. I'm using equivalent words to say the same thing. It is that interaction that brings physicality into being, because physicality is appearance. It's not standalone reality. And the word appearance has been used in Western philosophy in this sense for a long time. Kant did it, Owen Barfield did it. That's why I'm insisting on that word. I don't think we should invent new words for things for which we already have perfectly good words. More scientific evidence. I limited the quantum mechanics evidence to one slide because it's the one that's most difficult to talk about with a non-specialist audience. But just trust me, there's a lot more and stronger evidence from quantum physics than from neuroscience. So the proportions you see in this presentation do not reflect reality. They just reflect the ease of communication. That's all. But let's look at the evidence from neuroscience. For decades, we thought, people undergoing a psychedelic trance, mind-boggling, extremely rich, extremely intense experience, that probably is happening. Well, we thought that surely is happening because the drug lights up the brain like a Christmas tree, because experience is created by brain activity, we thought. So if you have an enormously rich and intense experience, then your brain activity must be off the charts. Finally, we got the technology to be able to look at people's brains while they're having a psychedelic experience. And their brains go to sleep. There is no activation anywhere in the brain, nowhere. All you see are deactivations in some very important regions, like you see here in blue, in a region we technically call the default mode network, which is responsible for our sense of an individual self. It's the ego, if you will. It's the Freudian or the Jungian ego. It correlates with that default mode network. And that network is dissolved by a psychedelic. That activity there just dissolved. The brain sort of goes to sleep, so to say. It's not only a statistically significant effect, it's a large effect. And then you might say, well, that's psychedelics. Other things are different. Are they? They did a study back in 2010, 10 years ago. Well, 10 years already. They studied people. I mean, these studies are nice because they are prospective studies. You can study someone before you give the psychedelic and then see what happens after you give the psychedelic. The same thing here. These people were going to undergo brain surgery for the removal of tumors. So you knew when damage would be inflicted in their brains beforehand. This is a so-called prospective study. Unlike, for instance, a near-death experience study, which is not prospective. You only know that after the fact because you cannot induce a near-death experience in anyone ethically. So these studies are powerful because they're not only controlled, they are prospective studies. So these people were studied before and after surgery. And the surgery for the removal of tumors always causes collateral damage. It impairs ordinary brain function. And then they scored people before and after surgery for feelings of transcendence, for that feeling you have when you don't recognize yourself as separate from the universe. You identify with the universe as a whole, feelings of self-transcendence. And there was a very significant increase in those feelings in people after the surgery. So I submit to you that psychedelics and these types of brain surgery, what they are doing is they are impairing the dissociative mechanism. They are making the dissociative boundary more porous, more permeable. So these people experience something beyond their individual selves because the dissociation is reduced. It gives us access to something beyond their dissociated alter, their individual self. And that's why you are seeing this enrichment, this intensification of experience accompanied by a reduction of brain activity. I submit to you that the brain activity that is being reduced is that brain activity that is an image of the dissociative mechanism itself. So a reduction in that brain activity is a reduction in the dissociative mechanism. And therefore, you have intenser and richer experience because you transcend the dissociative boundary, so to say. Your experience is enriched because the boundary is more permeable, more things can percolate through the boundary, so to say. And then you might say, well, that's just psychedelics and brain surgery. No, no, there's more. Mediums were studied in Brazil 8 years ago. People who claimed to be mediums. And the researchers came up with two groups of people. The people who thought had an authentic claim to mediumship, and people who they thought were just claiming to be mediums to make money. And they divided these two groups. And of course, for ethical reasons, they didn't call them what I'm calling them now, the fakers and the people who possibly were authentic. They called them the experienced mediums group, or EXP, and the less experienced mediums, or LEX. The LEX were the control group. These guys clearly thought these people were not mediums at all. They just claimed to be, but they needed to claim to be in order for the study to work, because they put these people in a controlled situation and they asked them, can you induce a mediumship trance and write down the information you gather from whatever transcendent source they claim to be in contact with? And the idea of the study was to see, can we differentiate objectively between probable real mediums, although we don't understand what's happening there, but probable real mediums and fakers. And they got more than what they bargained for. Because for all these brain regions that you see here highlighted in orange, these are key areas for rational cognition. And these are key areas for writing coherent text, which is what these people were asked to do while under the brain scanner. They were asked to write text. And all these key areas involved in writing coherent text For the LEX group, the less experienced mediums, brain activity increased, as you see here in the blue graphs. It's all pointing up. But for the EXP, probably the authentic mediums, it always went down. Brain activity reduced. And then these guys went further, and they decided to score the text these guys wrote according to an objective measurement of complexity. You have grammar and syntax analyzers available to us, run by computers, so entirely objective. You can input text, and they can give you a score of complexity. And the EXP group, the experienced mediums, they always wrote a lot more complex text while in trance. And that was completely counterintuitive because, you know, to write more complex text, you need to engage the areas of your brain, precisely these areas in which brain activity was shown to have reduced for them, not for the less experienced mediums. For the less experienced mediums, you clearly see the effort of engaging in writing text. Brain activity spiked in all these regions. And then you may say, well, it's only psychedelics, brain surgery, and mediumship. No, it's not. Partial strangulation leads to the same effect. If you partly strangulate yourself, you limit blood flow to the brain, metabolism in the brain reduces, you have brain activity, and that's why you may pass out. But guess what? Teenagers worldwide have discovered that if you almost strangle yourself to death, but not quite, you can have a mind-boggling psychedelic-like experience. You can go to alternative realities. You have a much richer and intenser sense of self. You experience things that you would never ordinarily experience. And this has been a very dangerous discovery because every year teenagers worldwide die of accidental strangulation having this trip without drugs. It's called the choking game. So if you have kids, pay attention to that. Pilots being trained to undergo G-force, they pass out. Somebody is not muted, just so you know. Pilots undergoing training for G-forces, they are put in a centrifuge, and they are rotated around at high speeds, and that drains blood out of their brains. This is called G-force induced loss of consciousness, or G-LOC. And guess what? A study done in 1990, people just were curious enough to ask these pilots, do you remember what happened when you passed out? And these pilots would report, and I quote, memorable dreams. They were not unconscious at all. They were experiencing things that they would never ordinarily experience. NDEs, near-death experiences, cardiac arrest, 30 seconds after cardiac arrest, you should have no metabolism in the brain. Maybe very, very small incidental residual metabolism, but nothing enough to generate a coherent experience under materialistic premises. But they report mind-boggling experiences, very rich, very intense. So these are all instances in which a reduction of brain activity or an impairment of brain function is correlated with an enrichment or intensification of experience, which doesn't make much sense under materialism, but makes a lot of sense if you think of ordinary brain function as the image not only of your individual mental processes, but also as the image of the dissociative process that you call yourself. If you impair that brain function, that is the image of dissociation, as opposed to being the image of your thoughts and emotions. If you impair the dissociation, you will have intensified and richer experience. And so I'm not surprised at all by this. And neither are our ancestors. Initiatory rituals throughout history have put people through a lot of physiological stress, sweat lodges, sensor deprivation. I mean, what do you think these things do? They compromise the physiology of the entire body, the brain included, and they therefore may lead to transcendent experiences. They may lead to the revelation of what these pre-literary people called the great secrets of reality, the secrets of the ancestors. How do you think that happened? It's through a impairment of the dissociative mechanisms. I could go on. Magnetic interference with the brain, called transcranial magnetic stimulation, has been found to induce out-of-body experiences in some people. Even brain illness and trauma, bullet wounds to the head, the progression of dementia. It's a phenomenon called acquired savant. Acquired savants have broadly impaired brain function. And yet they become more intelligent. They become more capable of artistic production. There is a guy in the US was hit by lightning, and he became an incredibly productive composer and piano player. Another one, well, I'll not tell you those stories. I'll speak forever if I start this. So these are explained through more porous dissociative boundaries. And last but not least, in the meantime, the list is a little bigger than this. Even the mainstream is becoming more sensitive to this. If you argue according to reason and evidence, there is no conspiracy to shut you up. There is a cultural prejudice, which can be very strong, can work almost as a conspiracy. There's no denying there is a cultural prejudice against anyone who is vocally against materialist metaphysics, like I am. And I have seen that. I have seen that in the way some academic papers I wrote were judged. But it's not a global conspiracy. It's just a bad habit, bad cultural habit. It's what I call, it's the way ants organize themselves. Well, never mind. Scientific American, the world's most respected popular science magazine, has published now, there are 11 here. In the meantime, there is more essays by me in which I am overtly against materialism and overtly pro-idealism. So things are changing. They always change a lot slower than we hope they would change. But they are changing. 5 years ago, what you're seeing in front of you right now in this slide would have been unthinkable. Well, 10 years ago, this would have been entirely unthinkable. In 2010, this would have been thoroughly unthinkable. These essays by me in Scientific American. I think I've said enough. I'm beyond my allotted time. I apologize. No, I'm right on time, actually. Huh. So I'll leave it here and open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. Could you please share your screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to get my mouse to stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
All right. So we have some questions. I have also like 3-4 questions, but so let's begin. It was a wonderful presentation, I must say.
Thank you.
And we have some questions in the chat. One is from the YouTube, from our YouTube channel. He's saying, "Hey Bernardo, this may seem like a naive question, but have you considered a hybrid model in which mind is the primitive, then follows materialism, and finally new mind models by creating materials?" You can read the question on the chat.
If the suggestion is there is a standalone reality to matter, which is created by mind, I don't see any reason to postulate that. Postulating that creates all kinds of problems. It immediately incurs the interaction problem. How can mind create something that is essentially distinct from itself? And I don't think it's needed, because as far as we can know, matter is an experience. It's the experience we call perception. It's one particular modality of experience. It's not even the only one. We also have abstract thoughts, emotions. So I wouldn't see the need to do that. In academic philosophy, you have this game a lot. People are interested in creating models. And why are they interested in that? Because they want to create original work. They want to publish original stuff and get tenure and advance their career. And when somebody like me is around, it's a threat to academic philosophy, because I'm basically saying, we don't need any of this stuff. There is one model and that's it. Why do we need to create more? Models that are more complex, less plausible, run into all kinds of insoluble problems. So look, for me, this is not a game. Philosophy is not a game. What about this? What about that? Could we think of this? Could we think of that? Yes, we can think of all kinds of things. We can ask all kinds of what-if questions. But so the important answer is not whether we can think of all that. The important thing is, do we need to do that? Do we need to create more models that are clearly inferior? Do we need that? I would submit to you that unless you're looking for tenure in academia. We don't need that. For me, this isn't a game. It's not a exhibition of different paintings to entertain people. For me, philosophy is a relationship with reality. I'm interested in what is real as far as my limited primate mind can discern. And I'm keenly aware I cannot find the ultimate answers because I'm a human being. I mean, saying that a human being can find the ultimate answers is like saying that my cat can find the ultimate answers. You see, if we were not around and cats were the most advanced beings on this planet, anyway, so yeah, I have considered all kinds of things, but they are utterly uninteresting to me because, again, for me, this isn't a game. This isn't a exhibition. For me, this is what life is about. For me, what is real? What is this going on around me right now?
Thank you. There is another question asking, how would you conceptualize near-death experience or other out-of-body perceiving modes, such as remote viewing? Does your framework make sense of topics such as reincarnation and non-material beings and so on?
I think I answered the question all the way until reincarnation, excluding reincarnation. So the answer to the first part of the question, how do we make sense of extrasensory experiences? I think, some people just have a naturally more porous dissociative boundary. Under my view, what we have to explain is the absence of psi, the absence of extrasensory experiences, because if everything is happening in what is ultimately only one universal mind, the most natural thing is that I wouldn't know what your thoughts are because we are all only one mind. So what we have to explain is why that doesn't happen all the time. And I try to make sense of that through the empirically known and undeniable phenomenon we call dissociation. But dissociation is not perfect. No process in nature is perfect. Some people have very good dissociative processes. I am one of them. I have a very, very hard head, as psychonauts describe. I have had psychedelic experiences, but I need to take a fair amount of psychedelics to move from my baseline. So my dissociative processes are pretty strong. I would be anything but a medium. Don't count on me for that. But I can easily imagine that some people are just different. They are physiologically predisposed to having a more porous, permeable dissociative boundary, and they pick things up that are beyond their individual self. I don't see any problem with that. Now, regarding reincarnation, it's a different story, and it's probably a long answer. For reincarnation, you see, what evidence do we have for reincarnation? It's some people report things that only others could have known, diseased people. There are two ways we can explain this, at least two ways. One is that diseased person has endured as an individual agent beyond physical death, and then has reincarnated into another individual agent, carrying its memories with it. That's one explanation. That's the classical interpretation of reincarnation. Another interpretation would be your individual agency does not survive death. You are a dissociated alter. If life is the image of the dissociation, death, the end of life, is the image of the end of the dissociation. So your consciousness will survive. You bet on that. You would still be on the other side saying, oh my God, it was really me. Yeah. But your individual agency will not. It will not be a person in the sense that a person is, by definition, a dissociated alter, and death is the end of that dissociation. But the experiences, including the memories that were circumscribed by the boundary of your dissociative process during life, when your dissociation ends, that boundary ends and releases its contents into a broader mental framework. So the memories of a dead person don't disappear. They are released beyond the original boundaries of that dissociative process. And it is conceivable that a living person who has, by nature, a relatively porous dissociative boundary can pick up those memories from the environment surrounding them, those memories that were released when the deceased died. That's another, maybe more parsimonious way of interpreting the evidence for a reincarnation. Or it could be that dissociation is a hierarchical process, and the physical body is what the tip of that hierarchy looks like. Not even the tip, because people can dissociate within themselves as well. So maybe what we can perceive with our five senses is just part of that hierarchical dissociative process. And when you die, you don't merge with the universal mind immediately again. You sort of fall back into a higher level of dissociation that our sense organs didn't evolve to pick up. So we don't see that. It could be. Do I think we have good reasons to believe that? I don't think so. I don't think so. But I may be prejudiced, because I hope that's not the case. I hope that Bernardo Kastrup doesn't survive as an individual agent, because individual agents are alarmingly prone to suffering, I find. So my personal hope is that that's not the case, but I admit the possibility that it may be.
Yeah, thank you, Bernardo. I have a question. There is a number of questions there, but my questions were formulated before the questions on the chat. So basically, my question is related to Daniel Dennett's theory of externalism, which is sort of mainstream. As you know, the externalist view of the world, there is no qualia, there is no subjective experience. And your theory supports the notion of qualia, there is qualia, and the experience is the key to understand what consciousness is. So what would you say about Daniel Dennett's work? Well, I had to ask this question, sorry.
It's either pathological or deceitful, because to deny the one sole undeniable fact of existence, which is there is experience, you gotta be pathological, or you gotta be in your face deceitful. I tend towards the pathological view. I think there is a widespread, unrecognized pathology in society, which is one's inability to understand what experience itself is. One becomes so alienated from reality and so married to theory that one becomes insulated from reality and spits out all kinds of utterly absurd things. I think Daniel Dennett, he doesn't have a theory. He will admit to you that he doesn't have one, because he never closed that theory. All he has is a list of provocative statements, which aren't even provocative anymore. They were provocative when Daniel Dennett's mentor was around in the 60s. Now they're just absurd, idiotic. But all he has is that list. I've lost my train of thought. I only have contempt for that, let me put it that way. I think it's ridiculous, and the fact that it's taken seriously and that somebody like that gets honorary PhDs, including from the university that awarded me my second PhD, I think it's shameful. It speaks to the state of shambles in which we find our philosophy today.
Yeah, thank you. I have my second question is, considering that your theory supports the notion that the only reality, or the reality, is universal consciousness, and considering that the notion of universal consciousness is an idea that has been promoted by a number of esotericists and religious traditions, why you do not address very much or acknowledge on your work this fact? Is it because esotericism and religions are in general considered, they are in the category of rejected knowledge in the academia?
Well, let me dispute
Yep, just let me conclude. For example, you mentioned that someone used the word spiritual, which is a word you avoid using because it's difficult to define. But it is also difficult to define consciousness, and you know that. So we have the same problem with both concepts. When we come to conceptual knowledge and definition, it's a challenge. So do you avoid it because of mainstream academia will accept better your knowledge or your theory if it's grounded or formulated within a terminology that's not rejected or so controversial?
Let me first dispute the premise of your question. I do acknowledge the similarities, well, even the identity with what many spiritual traditions have said. I wrote a book about it. It's called A Modern Allegory. It's a book about religious myths. So I would dispute that. But what you might be correct about, and may have led you to think that I sever the links, is that I compartmentalize that acknowledgement. I wrote a book about it, but I don't write about it in an academic paper. These are different things. So I'm very open about everything I'm saying, having been said by Indians in the Hindus Valley 3,500 years ago. I'm quite open about that. I'm quite open about the similarities with Western esotericism. I wrote about that in that book as well. But if I'm addressing philosophers, I don't talk about it. I will speak the language of philosophers. And if I'm talking to physicists, I'll speak the language of physicists, and I will appeal to arguments that resonate with physicists. It's just a strategy of communication. It doesn't mean that I reject the fact that everything I'm saying has been said before for at least a few thousand years. Now, it is true that I argue, okay, but there are three ways we can acquire knowledge about the world and about ourselves. I'll list the three to you. One is introspection, when you look inside yourself. And introspection is the basis of all spiritual traditions the world over. It's the way they reach their knowledge. It's through introspection, be it through prayer, be it through a spontaneous mystical experience, which is also introspective, be it through meditation, breathing exercises, yoga. This is all about acquiring knowledge through introspection. That's number one. Another source of knowledge is empiricism. Look around you. Don't look inside you, look outside. Take note of what's happening outside. Recognize the patterns and regularities of the behavior of nature as you can apprehend through observation, with or without instrumentation to help you in that process. So that's number two, empiricism. And number three is logical reasoning. Reasoning, in which you arrive at knowledge or you arrive at conclusions based on a series of rational steps of thought. Now, idealism or non-dualism, whatever you want to call this metaphysics I shared with you today, has been defended for thousands of years on the basis of introspection. That's what spiritual traditions have done. Do I need to add more to that? I don't think so. I think that job has been done marvelously well many times over. I don't think it needs to be helped. But the other two categories, the other two epistemic categories, ways of acquiring knowledge, have never been leveraged, at least not that I know, have never been leveraged in a consistent way to defend idealism. They are actually used most of the time to defend materialism. People say, well, materialism is what you conclude from empirical evidence and logical reasoning. And spirituality is what you conclude from introspection. But we all know introspection is not reliable, so spirituality is not true because empiricism and logical reasoning tell us unambiguously materialism is true. Well, I don't think that that's valid. I think this is false. I think empirical observation and logical reasoning would take you to the exact same place that introspection would take you. And because this has not been done so far, that's the weak point. That's where I focus, because that's where I think my contribution can make the biggest difference. It's not because I reject spirituality. I don't. I consider myself a spiritual person. But I will be very careful, one, arguing for idealism on the basis of introspection, because that will it's not where I can add value. And two, I will be very careful about using extremely loaded words like God, spirit, and soul. Do I think they're valid words? Yes. I think Carl Jung, for instance, used these words in a perfectly valid way. But I don't know what you think when I use these words. I think there are 7.5 billion definitions of God, soul, and spirituality in the world today. So I don't use them because I don't know what message I will be sending. I prefer to use words whose definition I can have better under control.
All right. So what is the definition of consciousness?
Everything is an excitation of consciousness. Consciousness is that whose excitations are reality.
Thank
Now,
you.
if you ask me to give you a reductive definition of consciousness, in other words, to explain consciousness in terms of something else, then I can't do that, because for me, consciousness is the base of the chain of reduction. I can explain everything else in terms of consciousness, but not consciousness in terms of anything else. Now, is this a weakness of my theory? No. Every theory has to have a bottom of the reductive chain. You cannot explain one thing in terms of another forever. At the end, you have to hit rock bottom and say, I'll explain everything in terms of A, but A itself has no reductive explanation, has no reductive definition. And your theory is good or bad, depending on your choice of A. I would say materialists choose matter as the bottom of that reductive chain. They would say, well, material fields or quantum fields, we cannot explain, they're just given, but we can explain everything else in terms of them. Well, I don't think that's good, because one, there are many fields, and two, you can't explain experience in terms of the fields. So I choose something else to be my ontological primitive, as we call it technically. And my choice is consciousness. So yeah, I can't give you a reduction definition of consciousness, but I can tell you my non-reductive definition is consciousness is that whose patterns of excitation constitute existence.
Thank you, Bernardo. We have 3 more or 4 more questions, and then we will close here. Otherwise, it's going to be too much. So, Bernardo, there is a question saying, how does what you have been presenting related to David Bohm's implicate? Yeah, can you read it?
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm not reading it, but I know what he means. Implicate order.
Yeah. And explicate, order.
Yeah. I think physicality, what we call the physical world, is the result of measurement or observation. And we know that these measurements can be entangled in ways we cannot make sense of if the ultimate reality is physical. David Bohm made sense of that by saying, well, what entanglement shows us is that the explicate order, or the physical world we can see and measure, is just an appearance of something more fundamental that lies behind it. And that more fundamental thing is the implicate order. And it is not physical in the sense that it is non-local. And therefore, entanglement is explained as different camera views on the same implicate order. So we are flabbergasted that 2 camera views can correlate so well instantly across time and space with one another, because we don't interpret them as camera views, we interpret them as the ultimate reality. So how can the ultimate reality on opposite ends of the universe be instantaneously correlated with one another? It doesn't make sense to us. But if you interpret it instead as no ultimate realities, but just 2 different camera views of the same implicate order, then entanglement makes sense. So do I agree with this? Yes, I agree with that. For me, Bohm's implicate order is what I'm calling the transpersonal thoughts and emotions, the transpersonal mental states of the world out there as it is in itself, which present themselves to us as physicality on the screen of our perception. So in that sense, I think what I'm saying is consistent with David Bohm's idea of implicate and explicate order. Now, there is something else often attributed to David Bohm, that's Bohmian mechanics. That is something entirely else, I disagree with Bohmian mechanics. I don't know whether your reader knows that there is a distinction there. So I am for the idea of implicate order. I am against the Broglie-Bohm interpretation of quantum physics.
Thank you. Bernardo, could you please write on the chat for us the book you mentioned in which you look at different religious traditions, so we could, everyone interested could get a copy. The other question is...
There it is.
Thank you very much. The other question is, I don't know if you can read the chat, I'm very far away. The word being only mental, what would you give as the reason for the outer word to be computable, subject to physics?
Yeah,
and the inner word conscious experience not be? Or would both neither be really computable?
Oh, now yeah.
It is from Caio Giurizato. Yeah.
It is unclear whether the premise of the question is true. Is the universe entirely computable? There is polemic about it. People who think it is adhere to a physical perspective called digital physics. But there are a lot of physicists who say, no, it doesn't make sense. Digital physics is not valid. Another important concept that usually gets mixed in here is the idea of whether the universe is computationally reducible, which is yet something else. Can you predict a future state of the universe by using some equations? So you can predict it faster than the time it takes the universe to get to that state by just being the universe. It's unclear that that would be possible at all. We can predict the trajectory of a ballistic missile by using equations, and we can predict that before the missile actually arrives at the destination. But it's unclear whether we can do the same for the entire universe. Actually, we have a lot of reasons to think it's not, that the universe is not computationally reducible in this sense. I think the motivation of the question is that book, a 1989 book called The Emperor's New Mind by Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics this year, in which he said that human thought, because of Gödel's theorem, human thought is not a formal system. It's not a computational algorithm, because we sort of can stand outside the system and we are not limited by Gödel's theorem. Well, even that book is polemical. It is unclear whether Penrose really has a point in that book. He wrote a new one, well, a new one at the time in the 90s called The Emperor's New Mind. No, I forgot the name of the second book. He makes a better case in that second book, but there is polemic about all this. All I can tell you is that what we do know is that computation is a way to model things. Computation is not a standalone reality. Although, media these days, series like Black Mirror and all that, and some crazy physicists like Max Tegmark, they try to think of computation as the foundational reality. Well, when you do that, you're replacing reality with an abstraction. I find that nonsensical. There is a very real, concrete reality around us, and we try to replace that with abstraction by saying the real world doesn't exist. All that exists is our description of it. That's what Tegmark says. Tegmark says the entire universe is just a series of abstract quantities and equations that relate those quantities. Everything else is what he called, and I will quote, baggage. I think that's entirely nonsensical, because nature's given is concrete. We then describe that given through abstraction, and then we take this bizarre step of saying, well, the abstraction, the description is all that exists, and the concreteness somehow comes out of the description. Yeah, it's like painting a self-portrait and saying, well, we are the self-portrait, and then having to explain our emotions in terms of the pattern of distribution of pigment on canvas. So to answer the question, I disagree with the premises of the question. So I can't answer it because I disagree with the premises. I think the jury is still out.
Thank you, Bernardo. There is a very technical question here, which I think you already touched on reincarnation. What about the FOA, Tibetan process, where personal content gets transferred to a next incarnation and pick it up again? I think this is a very technical question, Ignacio, and Bernardo already commented on his viewpoint on reincarnation. So, would you like to say something about it, Bernardo, again?
No, I don't know enough about
Yeah,
what this is to comment
yeah.
intelligently.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Bernardo. We really enjoyed this evening with you.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
It was wonderful. We will please support Bernardo's work. Subscribe to his blog. If you Google him, you will find his blog, and I have included the address to his blog on the newsletter. Also support his work, because he is really fighting against the mainstream and he needs support. So buy his books. And Bernardo, thank you so much. You are doing a wonderful work. Thank you for being here with us. That has been an honor, really.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everybody. It's been an honor for me, too.
So
Take
thank
care.
you.
Have a good evening.
We are
Bye.
closing our session today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernardo. Great talk.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Yeah, thank you.